Well, thank you. Sigurd, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. And you're right, there's a lot going on in the UK at the moment. You probably heard the news that Nicola Sturgeon has just been arrested, or rather, as the Scottish police rather primly put it, that a 52-year-old woman is assisting them with their inquiries, which I think is a highly dangerous thing for them to say, because they are assuming her gender, which I think in Scotland, under Nicola Sturgeon's own law, is quite a serious offence. And then, of course, as you say, Boris has resigned. I spoke to him this morning. It was exactly about that. Oh, the peerage. You know what I should have done, man? I should put you in the House of Lords. Boris, you did put me in the House of Lords. I've been in the House of Lords for 2 years. Yeah, I knew that. But it is such a pleasure to be here with you, ladies and gentlemen, with my dear friend Sigurd, with some other friends who I see in the room, and with some new friends. It is such a pleasure to be in Iceland, and I really want to just, because I'm going to say some gloomy things in a moment. But before I do, I always think you need to say this to any free market crowd. It is part of the condition of the classical liberal always to be discontented, and particularly to be discontented with their own government. And I'm sure that in this room, on every table, there are people saying, oh, we're doing this and that, and we might as well be run by the far left and so on, because that is just, I know enough of you, and I know rooms like this. So believe me, my friends, when I tell you that almost every other country in the world would gladly swap its problems for yours. I first came to this city in 1993. In fact, I was here when David Oddsson was elected, as Sigurd says, as a fellow young conservative. She's remained young, and I not so much. I had a full head of hair in those days. You see what 20 years in the European Parliament does to a man. My wife is now buying me a shampoo that's just called Shoulders. But the transformation of Iceland in those 30 years, if you're living with something, it's the easiest thing to be blasé, to take it for granted. But the physical change of this country, the growth and the prosperity is phenomenal. And that didn't just happen on its own, it happened because of wise policies and good people. In fact, when I first came here, I was reminding Sigurd of this. The first thing I did, because it was closer than Reykjavik, was to go to the then Blue Lagoon, which you didn't have to pay to go to, and it was in a different place. And the only infrastructure was a kind of shed that you could get shed. Some of the older people in the room will remember this, but believe me, actually no, you'll all be too young to remember this, looking around. Apart from Hannes Gissúrsson, but bear me out on this one, won't you? It was just a shed, and there was this was the moment when I thought, I love this country. There was one of those lane dividers, like you get on the top of a swimming pool, kind of floating on the top, and there was a little sign that said, if you swim further than this, you will boil to death. And I thought, yes, this is an independent country with independent people. There's no health and safety madness here. This is exactly the kind of liberal society that I'd like to live in, and I still kind of think that. And so, however depressed you get, and I want to talk about the impact of the lockdowns. Remember that during the financial crisis, Iceland played the role that Sweden played during the lockdowns. In other words, you were the control in the experiment that showed that the global consensus was wrong. I was one of a handful of people who opposed the bank bailouts when they were decreed. And everyone said, yeah, well, what would you do? What would your alternative be? And of course, I've been able to say ever since, well, look at Iceland. They didn't bail out the banks. They allowed people to take a loss. And, they slipped from the, fourth richest country in the world to the 11th for a bit or whatever it was. But then they came back stronger than ever without the debt burden that other countries carried. So with all of the problems on which you will all be very eloquent, believe me, this is a blessed country. Which said, things are going to get tougher for all of us, for you, for us, and for the rest of the world, because of what we went through. I was think back to the beginning of 2020. It's like another world already. My defining image of the beginning of that year was Boris. Actually, he was still Prime Minister, and he put a tweet out on New Year's Day, doing one of his sort of thumbs up. This is going to be a fantastic year. And little did we know, right? The end of January, we heard of this Chinese virus, a speck in the eastern sky, no bigger than a man's hand. And then I heard that they were quarantining whole cities, and I thought, thank God I live in a country where that couldn't happen. Boy, did we get that wrong, right? And it is extraordinary what we went through. And I'm sorry to relive it, but I think we have to. I think we have to go back and think about some of the things that were done in this panicky way. The taped-off playgrounds, the shuttered shops, the mental health problems hatching in silence, the bankrupt businesses, the moody teenagers, the lonely old people, the disrupted schools, and of course the piles of national debt. And worst of all, the constant public support for more. And the idea that we lived in societies where the individual had been elevated above the collective was lost. People were clamoring for more and more restrictions. And all the principles on which we used to build our societies went out of the window. The idea of proportionality, the idea of democratic control, the idea of where the burden of proof lies. I mean, how many times, I don't know, maybe I was the only person here having this conversation, but how many times did I have a variant of the following discussion where I would say, where are the data to show that these massive non-pharmaceutical interventions are effective? And people would say, well, better safe than sorry. And I'd say, hang on, wait a minute, it doesn't work like that. The burden is on you to show that it is necessary. It's not on me to show that the status quo is justified. If you are proposing the most unprecedented restrictions on human freedom, if you are wanting to confine the entire population to house arrest, something which in criminal law normally requires quite a high burden of proof, then it is not for me to show that it's wrong, it's for you to show that it's necessary. All of that went out of the window. Oh, no. 90% in Britain supported the first lockdown, 85% supported the second lockdown, 74% didn't want the restrictions lifted in the summer of 2021. And there was an attempt even to reimpose them, as there was here, as I understand it, over the Omicron version, the South African variant at the end of 2021. It turned out that a liberal society was very fragile, that the freedoms we thought we had were very contingent. The only example I can think of a similar restriction of our liberties because of an external threat, I think in Britain you have to go back to the Second World War. It's an observed phenomenon, I'm told by behavioral psychologists, that any collective threat, an earthquake, a war, a plague, makes people more authoritarian. And certainly that was our experience after 1945. It turned out that the powers that the government had assumed on a supposedly emergency basis in 1940, it was in no hurry to return when the emergency had passed. So we had identity cards until 1952. We had food rationing until 1954. We had full military conscription until 1960. And when you look at the economics, when you look at the economic policies that were put in place on a supposedly contingent basis during the war, most of them, exchange controls and so on, most of them were not repealed until Margaret Thatcher's government in the 1980s. Not because the population was prepared to tolerate it, but because the population was demanding it. The perceived collective threat had flicked switches in our brains. It had made us warier, more introverted, more demanding of the smack of firm government. And it condemned us to decades of socialism under all parties. It didn't matter which colour of party was in office. There was a collectivism that lasted for 40 years. And I'm afraid as I look at the world, I can see exactly the same thing now in response to the lockdowns and the crisis that preceded them. It's a very difficult thing for any party now, in any country, to get elected proposing to do less, to give powers back, or to have tax cuts, or for privatization or to pull out of things. It's an incredibly... These were never easy arguments to win, but we could win them prior to 2020. Now we are swimming strongly against the current. If I can say this definitively only of my own country, but I don't think we're alone. Public spending shot up. Of course it did in 2020. And there is now an almost universal assumption that it has to stay there and that taxes have to rise to meet it. It's become politically almost impossible to argue that spending should return to the level of January 2020, even though it was all supposedly on an emergency basis. Now, of course, it's true we've wound up the furlough scheme. We don't give the emergency grants to businesses anymore. But the massive increases in healthcare and social security spending, people are now digging in and defending that as though it's some immemorial part of the Constitution. And all over the world, you see these budgets rising. And for what? This is where it gets really interesting. See, during the campaign, I was one of the literally handful of columnists who was anti-lockdown from the beginning. I thought it was disproportionate. I thought it was excessive. I thought the case hadn't been proved. And I resented the reversal of the burden of proof. But when I look now, people would say at the time, I got more abuse probably than on anything I've ever done as a columnist over those early weeks. And people would say constantly, you are putting the economy before lives. That was the phrase they used, which, by the way, shows a terrifying lack of understanding about what the economy is, right? A lot of people plainly think that the economy is some kind of disembodied machine that turns out ingots of gold for rich people, rather than being the name that we give to the everyday transactions that make us happier, right? But the economy couldn't exist without the lives. But it now turns out that even in its own terms, that argument is looking more and more ropey by the day. I should have said it the other way around. Sweden was the Iceland of this crisis, right? There was a control in the experiment all along. We forget the abuse that other countries aimed at the Swedish government in the early months of 2020. They didn't say, if Sweden doesn't have a lockdown, it may have a very slightly higher mortality rate than Finland. They said, by refusing to do what everyone else is doing, they are condemning themselves to a national catastrophe. The disease will double and double and double. It'll go exponential, the hospitals will be overwhelmed, and they are facing civilizational collapse. Now, to put this as neutrally as I can, that didn't happen. Sweden, it now emerges, had the lowest mortality, the lowest excess mortality rate of all OECD countries in 2020 and in 2021. There are different measures of this. There's the Johns Hopkins one, there's a UN one. On every league, Sweden is either at the top or very close to the top globally as the country that had the fewest deaths at the height of the pandemic. Right? And I just think we are very reluctant to process the implications of that, because it suggests that what we went through, all of the disruption, all of the economic pain, and all of the social and cultural pain, to say nothing of the undiagnosed mental health problems and so on, and the unscreened cancer, that all of it was a panicky overreaction that may have killed more people than it saved. How can I say may have killed more people than it saved? Well, the scariest thing for me, or the most sobering thing, is if you look at those excess mortality figures and you compare Sweden, where there was no lockdown but where everyone got COVID, to Australia and New Zealand, where there were almost no COVID deaths because they could isolate themselves, but where, particularly in South Australia, there were some in Victoria, there were some very strict lockdowns. There was a higher excess death rate in Australia and New Zealand than in Sweden, which, prima facie, the simplest interpretation, is that the lockdowns killed more people than they saved. Now, I'm sorry to bring this up, I don't want to depress you all, but we have to face up to it, because otherwise the lockdowns will remain a part of the arsenal of each government every time there is a future health scare. We may be certain that there will be another epidemic. Maybe it'll be the same as this one, maybe it'll be more dangerous, maybe it'll be one that's this time threatening to children. We need to have a sober assessment of whether these non-pharmaceutical interventions were effective. It won't do to say all over again, oh, better safe than sorry. Oh, what's your alternative? Oh, it doesn't really, just a few more months of this. That's the worst kind of sunk costs mentality. I can liken it, because I think of the damage we did, I liken it to what happened after the First World War had begun. If we had seen, every participating country, if we'd seen where the First World War was going to end, none of us would have embarked on it. If we'd had any premonition of the amount of suffering that we were inflicting on ourselves. But once you've started, the only way that you can justify the deaths is total victory. And so the pain becomes its own vindication. Unless we have total victory over the other side, all our young men have died in vain, right? It's a very natural human response. It's a bit of faulty wiring in our brains. But unless we look at this rationally, we are liable to repeat that mistake over and over again. And each time it does, the government will get a bit bigger, freedom will be squeezed out, the rule of law will be prejudiced, and we will become needlessly poorer. And that's why I am looking to you as a friend of Iceland and a friend of Icelandic democracy, and particularly to those of you in this room, to go back to first principles and make the case for why we are richer and freer and happier if the state is smaller. Why we live more fulfilled and more diverse and more satisfying lives if we're not micromanaged, if we're free to exercise our own virtue and make our own decisions. I think it's in the DNA of this country. I mean, there's lots of, somebody was telling me the other day that actually the first settlers had really come via Northumbria, or from Northumbria via Norway and so on. I like the foundation story of Iceland, that people were getting away from high taxes. That seems to me to chime with why Iceland was so divergent from Scandinavia. But whatever the origins, and you guys will know this and I don't, this was then a country that genuinely had independent, self-reliant people. People who looked to themselves for solutions rather than putting their hands out and expecting solutions from the state. And for a long time there was no option, right? I mean, that was the nature of living in a place like this beautiful but isolated block of black volcanic rock a long way away from anywhere else. You had to be independent. And I think people understood that to be an independent citizen, you also needed to live in an independent country. And I think those were factors that informed Iceland's correct and wise decision not to join the European Union. But all of that, my friends, is for nothing if we're prepared to hand away our freedoms every time there's a panic. If we're prepared to forget all reason, all logic, all empiricism, and say, oh, better safe than sorry. If we're prepared always to put safety above liberty. If we do that, we end up with neither of them. Whereas if we try and defend our traditional freedoms, we may just end up with both. So let me finish with a plea to those of you in this room to honor the inheritance that you have been privileged to take from your parents, above all, the inheritance of being an independent people, especially those of you who are in a party called the Independence Party. That, if nothing else, you have to be the party, the Sjálfstæðisflokkur, in the party that actually stands up for people who stand on their own 2 feet. It is the most precious of all patrimonies. Please keep it intact and hand it on securely to your children.